Experience Darden podcast. I'm your host, Brett Twitty, and you are listening to a new episode. On this episode of the podcast, I'm excited to share a conversation I recently recorded with Greg Fairchild. Greg is a professor at the Darden School of Business, and he is also Associate Dean for Washington, D.C. area initiatives. Greg and I recently caught up to talk a little bit more about a literature class he leads as a second-year elective at the school. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Greg Fairchild. Greg, welcome to the podcast.
Hey there, Brett. How are you?
Doing well. How are you holding up? First of all, let's start there. How are things?
Well, Brett, it's an uncommon time, to say the least. In so many ways, work has changed. I've been teaching classes, and I'm doing that online. I've been meeting virtually. I've been hanging out and having coffee virtually. And I've been trying to find a way to refigure the way that I go through my days. So it's the experience all of us are having, and I think the one none of us anticipated.
I can agree with that last point. I think certainly it's been pretty profound change for those of us who were used to coming into Sam's Family Grounds and working every day, and now working remotely and having to connect with our colleagues virtually. I know this is a shared experience for many people around the country, across the globe. Before we get into sort of the meat of our conversation, we've gotten a lot of questions from prospective students about the online classes, right? So Darden has shifted to virtual classes for the remainder of the semester. You're someone who has taught in the online setting for quite a while. How are those classes going?
Well, Brett, I have taught in the online setting, and we do so much of that in our executive MBA program. We also do it in some of our executive teaching as well. It is something I have experience with, but in fact, this is a little different. In other occasions, we have the benefit of tacking between the online class and the in-person class, and there's different types of rapport and engagement you can have in each of those settings. What we're doing now is a bit different in that there are classes that I started last week where I haven't actually physically been in the room with the participants, and as it appears, I'm not going to physically be in the room with the participants in real time. Now, what that does is that means I have to think really hard about how I connect people together. And so we've created learning teams and learning groups within the class. It's about 70 people. We've created ways that people can interact asynchronously. That is, we give them assignments to do and things to do together that they do in between class meeting times. I think one of the things that will be a virtue out of this moment for all of us is that there'll be some things we'll all learn about teaching that we didn't know before, that we didn't do before, that'll make us better teachers in the end.
So a silver lining in some of this, and it sounds like a lot of creative thought about how to deliver classes and still build that community within the classroom.
Well, there are a few people both in our building and really across the country who are experts in this, and so it turns out, again, because of an online medium, one can find great examples of things that other people do. On the other hand, one also can find blooper reels of things that people do as well. There are loads of memes of professors who are teaching online, and then the things and mistakes they might make sitting in a closed room, are now known and are trending fast on the internet. So they're both great things to learn and great things to watch out for.
All right. Well, one of the reasons I invited you to the podcast, you've been on the Exec MBA podcast before. This is our full-time MBA podcast. You teach a class that I think might be surprising to many of our listeners to learn that we have as an elective at Darden, a literature course. But before we get to that point, let's talk a little bit more about you and your background. So who are you and what is your role at Darden?
Who am I? Boy, this is a metaphysical question, Brett. I'm someone who in some ways has become the accidental professor. I came to Darden over 20 years ago, over almost 30 years ago, to study as an MBA student on the notion that I was going to become a marketer, and I did so. Went on to Procter & Gamble and became a marketer in the cosmetics and the hair care business. And then I always had this vision that for me, there would be this intersection between business and society. And when I got to Darden, there were professors that were discussing those things, and they were discussing them in unique ways. So ethics was a core part of the curriculum. Professors like Ed Freeman were big influences on me. But then there was the added part that this way of learning, a way of learning where you could share a part of your own personal analysis, your own personal walk, your journey, was really exciting to me. And so with that seed planted, after I became a marketer, after a few years, I applied and thought about going back and getting a PhD, which I did. And I always had it in the back of my mind that there was, again, something unique about the way we delivered education at Darden, and I wanted to possibly be a part of it, and with great news. When I went back out into the market looking for a job, Darden invited me back.
So that brings me to sort of my next question of what do you teach? What are your research interests? And for our listeners, they can look on the website and see that your academic area, strategy, ethics, and entrepreneurship. But what does that look like in terms of the classes that you teach, in terms of the things that you're interested in researching?
So I am in the strategy, ethics, and entrepreneurship area, and you're spot on. I cover the waterfront on all of those. Over the years at Darden, I've taught the core strategy class that's part of the core courses in the first year. I've taught entrepreneurship electives, and I've also taught electives that get into the question of how entrepreneurs build new communities and new markets. That's always been a part of what I've done. The ethics through literature class, which we'll talk about in a little bit, has been yet another thing, but I've really covered that entire area. In terms of the things that have driven me from a research standpoint, they actually come back to those discussions that happened at Darden when I was a student. I've been very interested in the way that businesses do and don't reach the fullness of society. So, when I was young, there was a lot of discussion about us thinking about the things that firms did that, let's call them sins or let's call them bads. And there was less written about the things that firms could do to improve on conditions. So you might see articles about, let's think differently about air pollution or water pollution, or ways that people might think about things that they might have been doing with animal testing. An entirely different set of questions drove me. What are the things that firms are doing in places that people might otherwise overlook? What's happening in food deserts, and how does one grow a grocery store short margin business in a food desert? What are people thinking about in new immigrant communities in terms of offering financial services or loans for businesses? How do those things get financed, and by whom? What types of ways can we think about creating housing options for people that are affordable, and how do those things run through the balance sheet? So those have always been the things that have driven me, and I found my way to do cases, or I found my way to write papers that do quantitative analyses of these type of questions. One of the most recent cases we've been working on is with the Virginia Economic Development Partnership and its leader, Stephen Murray. Stephen is the gentleman that negotiated the deal that brought Amazon to Alexandria, Virginia. And the entire set of activities involved in thinking about an economic development package and how it would benefit the Commonwealth of Virginia, but then how one engaged with a business on that, that's the type of thing that really interests me. Be it a large company like Amazon, or be it the small bodega on the corner.
And one of the activities at Darden that we've had some students on the podcast to talk about is the Darden Prison Project. You're involved with this. Your wife is also involved with this. What brought you to this work initially, and what sustained your interest in being a part of this?
So I didn't know students had talked about it on the podcast. That's great. It's again kind of an accident, Brett. It's not the thing that I would have anticipated I'd be talking to you about. We've been doing this now for 9 years, and really the impetus for it was a letter that was passed to me from a gentleman who was currently incarcerated, who was very interested in improving his post-release opportunities by getting more education. Education in prison in the United States is something that's in short supply, and it's even declined from some levels that existed in prior decades. And even as that's been true, business education is something that's in incredibly short supply. So these opportunities to help prepare people for the next step they make as they re-enter the job market in the business world became the initial idea. I would have never guessed that we'd reach a place with this program where there were fewer slots available for students to teach in prison than there are students that are interested in doing so. It's an amazing thing, and it speaks to the importance of the issue in society. It speaks to the passion that Darden students have for this type of opportunity to make a difference.
And what do students tell you about the experience? When they reflect on the time that they spent, working with the prisoners, any surprises for them, or any sort of takeaways that kind of, you mentioned 9 years of doing this work. I imagine there may be some shared outcomes or learnings along the way.
Oh, sure. Well, on the MBA student side, we can tell you that we hear that these are life-changing experiences for many of the students. This can range from people who had an interest in simply understanding better the concepts they learned in their MBA program and doing a better job of explaining them, recognizing that these are things they were going to need to do when they started work. The process of teaching forces you to really know a subject deeply. And so for some students, it's that moment when they come from the classroom and they can see that people have learned something. And there's that feeling of accomplishment that you've transferred knowledge that ends up being useful to someone else. Additionally, there are many, many life-changing stories. And I think what many students will tell you surprises them is that the population in prison is more reflective of the population in society than TV shows might give you the impression. Students have found that there have been veterans of the military in our wars. There have been people with master's degrees that have included technical fields like engineering. There are people that are in the room also that are among the lowest income in society. And so that mix is a unique mix, and the students have the experience of traversing that period with the participants that are from the prison over 9 months. And when those men and women graduate, they go to a graduation ceremony that usually occurs after the Darden graduation. And students come back to Charlottesville for that graduation ceremony in the prison. They meet the families, they meet the children, they meet so many people that have been assisting these people in making their transition in life. And so it's a really exciting moment for both parties.
I can imagine. And, it's an interesting experience to think about, particularly in the context of developing business leaders. How do you see this kind of experience being important to that development?
Well, again, I'd see it as two-sided. First of all, we can tell you that people that have been in the program have started businesses. We know that there are people that have been in the program that are now in college. We know there are people in the program that are legal assistants. We know there are people in the program that came to the program that are now apprentices. So that whole range has occurred. But we also think there's another change. We think that we now have MBAs, people who will be in decision-making positions later on in their life, who will have a different point of view on the prison population. They'll have a nuanced view that will come from that directed experience. And our expectation is that there'll be meetings one day that leaders will be sitting in. Someone will say, well, we don't think we should hire this person because they have a misdemeanor or they have a felony. And someone will be sitting in that room and say, well, gee, I know some people who have misdemeanors and felonies, and I think they can do good work. And it'll be that moment where we will have changed the equation from both the supply side and the demand side.
No, that's incredibly powerful as you think about these kind of conversations and the opportunity for impact, both as a student and obviously beyond. So, Greg, we have been talking about having you come on the podcast to talk about your literature course for quite a while, at least a few weeks. Recognizing that it's a course that prospective students may not expect to find in an MBA elective curriculum, and we were joking before we got on the call today that given this moment where people are looking for things to watch and maybe even for things to read, this could be a particularly interesting time. to talk about your literature course. So maybe to set the stage a bit for our listeners, what's the name of the course and what's the focus of the course?
Well, first of all, Brett, look, what your listeners should know is that you yourself are a big literature fan, right? That you're a voracious consumer, and you and I have had a relationship for some time where we're comparing books we're both reading. So I wouldn't want us to get past this without admitting that you yourself are pretty deeply involved in this same type of discourse.
Well, I appreciate that. I absolutely enjoy reading. I'm an old English major myself and active library user. So, I'm also personally interested in this conversation too. So I appreciate the shout out.
Well, about the class, first of all, I would love to tell you that I created the class, but I didn't. I took the class as an MBA student with a guy named Ed Freeman, who, as I said earlier, influenced me to get a PhD. And you know what? I wrote a short story in that class, and after I got out and I was working in marketing, I one day saw an ad in a newspaper for an opportunity for first-time authors to be published. And I submitted a version of the story I'd originated in this class, and it got published. And for me, that was really, really powerful. And so years later, to get the chance to teach that very class, which I've done for about 12 years now, has been a real excitement. The class has always had a social aspect to it, and by that I don't mean social change. I truly mean social aspect. The class, again, separates the group into mini groups, 6 or 7 people, and they have dinner every week, and they talk among themselves about the books that are there, because there's stuff we can do in a classroom, and there's stuff that's more powerful and intimate that happens outside a classroom. And then over the years, the students have always come to my home and had dinner with me and my family. And we, again, can have these discussions about the meaning that comes out of a certain story. About the structure of the course itself, so it's all fiction. It's all novels and short stories. People are surprised because business schools are so much about nonfiction. And, I always remind people of 2 things. Case studies are narratives. So Darden, the case method school, we believe in the case study. The case study is a story about how a manager made a decision. Now it's a nonfiction story, but it's a story nonetheless. So narrative is an important part of the way we believe people take in information and learn. And then what I try to remind people of is that fiction has this wonderful ability to engage us, to help us see ourselves, and to help us ask questions about ourselves and our society that we wouldn't be able to do otherwise. And so this is one of the reasons I find the course so powerful. We don't have to burden ourselves with whether something is true. We can have a discussion about what if it could be.
And I think we also both agree that fiction is a great way. I mean, nonfiction also works this way, but fiction is a great way of getting outside of one's own experience and potentially looking at the world from a different vantage point and a different perspective, and kind of stretching in this way. I think from our conversations, you might feel similarly about that point. Maybe art generally as being expansive.
Well, I do. I tell students, Brett, that this is not a class that's going to help them get their first job. And that they're looking for classes that will show up on their resume to help them get their first job. This is probably not going to be the one. However, this could be the class that helps them be a better leader years from now. So there are really 2 insights there. The class in so many ways is about the human condition and how we live together and how we don't. People who come through MBA school are going to have unusual influence over their lives and others. And so a greater insight into the breadth of the way people experience the world is probably important. And then next, so much of being a leader is ineffective storytelling. There certainly is the technical experience and the technical knowledge, but after that comes the real opportunities and need for something that can allow people to have the depth of understanding and connect with people through stories. And there's no better way to become a better storyteller than to read good stories.
Couldn't agree with you more on that point. So what do you read in the course? I imagine the syllabus has evolved over the years. Maybe what's currently on your syllabus, and how do you pick what you read?
So the stories that I end up using are everything from some of what people will call classics like Hemingway, Faulkner, F. Scott Fitzgerald. But I've also included authors that are more recent. So, and even some that end up getting turned into movies, although I don't know if the movies are that good. But an example would be Kazuo Ishigura's Never Let Me Go is a book I'm reading with students this term. This is a book that some of you may know. It's science fiction. And the great thing about science fiction is even more powerful in letting us let go of ourselves and letting us see an alternative society. I also at the same time will read something that strikes me as being very current as a short story. And so George Saunders has been called one of the greatest authors of our time. He writes very out of this world short stories that really, again, cause us to really think closely about what we're doing. I have a short story that I use that he has set within what is a dinner theater, which is based on medieval times. But in that setting, which is very, unusual, something really, really powerful happens, and the players have to deal with this circumstance, which is, again, unusual, powerful, and in many ways scary. At the same time, I've taught things like that don't fall within the U.S. A Thousand Splendid Suns is a book that I've used from time to time, which talks about the experiences of two young people under the Taliban. And so the range is both geographically broad, it probably spans the 20th and 21st century, and it's everything from science fiction to settings just around the corner.
So I realize it's probably hard to pick a favorite book or story to teach, but if you were going to lead one class and pick one reading for that class, or a series of classes focused on one reading, what might you pick?
Oh my. So the joke here is I would say William Styron's Sophie's Choice would be the one, because everyone knows, if you know that piece, you know that it's about there is no choice. Sophie's asked to choose between one of her two kids. So that's a joke. One of the things that I have found really powerful is I'll just say that I often use The Great Gatsby, and I do so because not that I think it's my favorite, but it's such a novel that many people have read when they're in high school. And they read when they were young. Reading that novel as an adult is a very, very different experience. The characters are actually young adults at the time of the story. The situations in the story, I think, are hard to reach and appreciate and empathize with when you're 17. They're very different to empathize with and reach when you're 28. Next, I find that there's some more recent stories. The Sense of an Ending is a book out by Julian Barnes, and it's received some awards, but more importantly, it's a book that's about the way we reflect on our lives and the little lies we tell ourselves, or the truths we tell ourselves, and how we deal with those things. Again, so many of the stories are about relationships and about the power that we have in our relationships and the way we use them. And yes, so many of the stories are about the strength we have in the organizations that we're in and the positions we hold in those organizations, and how we should think about how we wield them.
So obviously, reading a lot of different kinds of works. You mentioned the breadth of the reading list. What do you hope students get out of the course? You mentioned that it's likely not the course that's going to get them a job, but might make them better leaders, better people. Curious, what's your hope in terms of the students' learning outcomes or personal outcomes?
So it's interesting you ask about what I think people get out of the class and why they're there. Every year I do a survey right at the beginning of the class to find out who's in the room. And one of the things is I ask questions like, How many of you are English majors? And in fact, there are a good number of English majors in the class, so probably about a third. But I think what often surprises me is about 20% of the students had never taken a literature class before. And so what I notice is that I think that there are people that learn to read differently when they're in this class, and they can appreciate things that they might not have taken time learning to appreciate before. I think secondly, what I hope is they'll become, again, better storytellers and better listeners, because other people are trying to tell you their stories. And oftentimes, for those of us who have the benefit of going to places like Darden, those people will be trying to tell their story and you will be their boss. And so your ability to weave your story in with theirs, to connect with them, will be a big part of the way that you can establish and build rapport that'll lead people to feel greater senses of commitment and connection to you. It's far easier to tell a story about yourself than it is for you to say, you know what, I have the following fears and I have the following doubts. A story does that far better than you just saying it.
So we've had a lot of conversations about movies and books, short stories, art generally. You seem to be someone who has a real passion for the arts. And I was curious, this is a big question, but what does art mean to you, and what value do you think it could have for someone who is an aspiring business leader?
Oh my. So when you say we've talked about, you do mean you and I on our personal conversations.
That's correct.
And again, for your listeners, Brett and I have talked a lot about that. I think it's probably three things. So the first is, what I may not have said is that, the beauty business and the fashion business, which is where I worked when I was a marketer, those businesses are art culture businesses. And you're very invested and engaged in the arts when you're in those businesses. And so in some ways, I was drawn at the earliest parts of my career, continue to be drawn to the business of culture or cultural products. That's always been a part of what I found engaging. I think next, I have believed and tend to believe that art is a reflector of our society. There's always a debate on whether art is reflecting or influencing. And I have a tendency to lean more toward that it's reflected. When we see art, for me, I think that we then see ourselves, sometimes what we didn't want to see or what was obscured to us. But I don't know that I think it comes out of nowhere. And so for me, the arts, I think, be them visual, auditory, reading, they're telling us a lot about who we are. And it's part of, I guess, a general sense of a journey to self-actualization and self-understanding. The third thing I think is that when we think of, quite honestly, influence on the global scale, I could make a strong argument that the arts industry in the United States, be they the video arts, be they the music arts, and yes, certainly writing, have arguably been influential on the global scale, unlike many industries. So U.S. art and culture is known and seen all over the world. I can remember going to Iceland and going out to dinner, and the entire music that was being played in an Icelandic restaurant was popular music from the United States. And this was not an American restaurant in Iceland. I found the same thing traveling around the world. I'm a jazz fan. People will ask me, or I'll find jazz musicians everywhere. This is an American art form. So I think the third part is it seems to have global legs and power. And I think that intrigues me and gives me a sense that there's something universal that's being spoken to, even as the art itself may be generated from one country or another.
So this is, as I mentioned, and as you also mentioned, this is a time when people are obviously staying at home, spending a lot of time on Zoom or on computers during their day, and maybe looking to take a break from their screens in the evening. We had talked about the likelihood that people may be reading a little bit more or looking for something new to read. Do you have? Well, let's say this. What are you reading right now, and do you have any recommendations for our listeners?
So this is a great question. There are things that I read and there are things that I use in the course. The course I'm using to try to raise and elevate various touch points about the human journey. What I may read for myself is a very, very different thing. And let's just talk about a sample of things that I've read recently. There's a wonderful short story collection I read by Zadie Smith, which is called Grand Union. And I like short stories, and so I'll dip into those from time to time. Currently I'm sitting on a book called Deacon King Kong by James McBride. I've only just started this book, but McBride has been a National Book Award winner. It's a story about someone who shoots a deacon in a church. Well, we'll figure out how that goes. I can't tell you just yet. There are books I reread. I'm an old James Baldwin fan, and I reread his things. But then in addition, I am a Faulkner fan, and I reread some of his things. So there's things that I return to. A book I'll read in the class that I return to and love rereading for the class is a book called Alice Always. And this is one that's really a fascinating story about a woman that comes into a family after a member of the family has died. And while that's a very, very challenging opener, the book itself becomes very much about her relationships with the family, each as individuals. Very powerful piece.
Those are all great recommendations. I think it was certainly a pretty healthy start for folks looking to build out their reading list over the next few weeks. So, Greg, thank you so much for your time this morning. I recognize how busy everyone is right now. I'm going to ask just one more question here. A question we ask frequently of the guests here on the podcast. So we have prospective students who listen to the podcast. So what would be your pitch as to why Darden to our prospective student listeners?
Well, Brett, this is a fascinating question for me. I'm a Darden alum. My wife is a Darden alum. I came back to Darden as a professor. So I have a multi-decade relationship with the school. I think Darden is a unique place, again, because of the centrality of the way we engage the student. Now, there's always a huge discussion about the case method, and that's absolutely true. But I also can tell you that having dinners at your professor's house, which happened to me, and is a tradition that I've continued, has been really, really great. Over the years, Darden is a place that the professors don't always take themselves so seriously. So I can tell you that I've been in Iron Chef cooking competitions with students. I can tell you that I've been in Dancing with the Stars moments with students. I can tell you that I've traveled and camped with students, and I've seen part of the world with students. And so it's a type of place where the walls between the professor and the student can be broken down. And I think that's a part of this experience that we don't always get to say. I think the other thing that I would say makes Darden different and unique is this, again, centrality of the notion that business really can make a difference in society, that business and society are not separate, they're actually together. It's why I came back to Darden. It's what inspired me when I was at Darden. I should say that a time like now in American society, in the global society, is one where there's probably no greater appreciation that we're all in this together. And that if it's the government through stimulus or if it's businesses through the way they extend themselves to their customers and their employees, and understanding the fullness of this thing is really critical right now. So for me, Darden's always been there, but I feel like there's no better time than now for this type of message.
That's a great point. If you think about how important leadership is at this particular moment, people always ask us as admissions folks, what is Darden about? And I think, at least personally, I've long felt that it is, in just many different ways of saying it, a leadership school, and about developing leaders. That's obviously in the mission statement. And so your point certainly resonates with me.
Beautiful.
Well, Greg, thank you so much for your time. It's a pleasure. Always fun talking books and culture with you. I always enjoy your perspective. I thought our listeners would enjoy hearing about your literature class, because, again, it's maybe not what they have in mind when they think about a top MBA program, but I think it is reflective of what makes this MBA program unique and interesting, and maybe just a little bit different.
Marvelous. Thank you, Brett.
And that was my conversation with Greg Fairchild, professor at the Darden School of Business and Associate Dean for Washington, D.C. Area Initiatives. As always, if you have any comments, suggestions, requests, anything you'd like for us to cover here on the podcast, we're all ears. We can be reached at Darden, that's DARDEN, @virginia.edu. And until next time, thanks for listening. Be well.